the king of let's try again. Just in case we didn't get the thing, I'll reintroduce Julia. Julia Kim is going to talk to us today. She is a member of the Club of Rome, and she is an advisor to the Kingdom of Bhutan on the idea of gross national happiness. And she's going to tell you something about that and what it really means. It's a bit of a reaction to the way so many other parts of the world decide that they can only count money. And this is a bit of a change. Julia is also a doctor, and she has worked in South Africa, amongst other places, to try and make a difference. And with her is Charles Holmes, who is a specialist in participatory processes and in helping to try and get us all to think a little differently. And he's going to be helping put this session on. So I will now turn it over to both of you. Charles, are you going to go first, or is Julia? And even Charles, you should keep your...
I'll keep my microphone on.
Yes, and I would ask everyone else, please make sure they stay off to make sure we do have the bandwidth. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ted, and welcome everybody. Welcome especially to those who are guests of CACOR, and for those of you who are guests, CACOR is the Canadian Club of Rome group, and I especially want to acknowledge Art and Ted and David, who are with the Canadian Club of Rome and are hosting this special session today. I would just want to say I'm joining you from the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, otherwise known as North Vancouver in British Columbia. And it's just an absolute delight and honor to have the opportunity to do this together with my dear friend Julia. I must say that one of the silver linings of COVID was to discover that Julia is in fact a neighbor, and prior to COVID lived in Bhutan, but now lives in a place called Port Moody, just down the road from me. And so Julia and I've had the pleasure of running a number of sessions, including one previously for the Club of Rome. So forgive me to those who are watching this as a YouTube video. I just want to give a couple of instructions and introduction as to how this session is going to flow for those who are here live. Encourage you to use the chat to put in questions, as Ted has already suggested. We are going to do breakout rooms twice, so there will be the opportunity to engage with 3 or possibly 4 other people in conversation. My plea and request is that when you have the opportunity to engage in dialogue, that you monitor the time. The feedback we get is there is often never enough time for the conversations and for the questions and the explorations that we're going to have together. But Julie is going to share some content. We'll reflect on it in small group, talk about it. We'll have a bit of we refer to it as a harvest. We'll hear from folks what struck them. Julia will share a little bit more. We'll have a bit of a Q&A opportunity. Then we'll be back into small groups again, and then back together as a large group. So that's a little bit of the flow. Julia will say more about the intentions when she begins the session. So, and also welcome to those of you who are not part of Club of Rome. I know there are a number of people, particularly from here in Vancouver. Julia and I will acknowledge you and speak to a little bit of your work as we go through this. So welcome everybody. I start with the land acknowledgement. The reason I do that is in the last number of years, I have found myself drawn more and more to learning with and from the indigenous people who really were here on this land before us. And to kick us off, before I hand it over to Julia, she and I talked about what's become a very favorite book of mine. It's called Embers by Richard Wagamas, an Ojibwe writer who has since passed away. And this passage that I'm going to read to you from this book speaks very much to the broader intention of this conversation, which is very much about the importance and power of relationship and connection. So the words of Richard Wagamas from Embers. From our very first breath, we are in relationship. With that indrawn draft of air, we become joined to everything that ever was, is, and ever will be. When we exhale, we forge that relationship by virtue of the act of living. Our breath commingles with all breath, and we are in fact part of everything. That's the simple fact of things. We are born into a state of relationship, and our ceremonies, our rituals, and our gatherings are guides to lead us deeper into that relationship with all things. Big lesson: relationships never end, they just change. In believing that lies the freedom to carry compassion, empathy, love, kindness, and respect into and through whatever changes. We are made more by that practice. So we invite you into this opportunity to learn and to be in relationship. And I'm going to turn it over now to Julia for the first part of our conversation.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to begin by picking up the theme of the breath that Charles just invited us into, and also to bring in a little bit of the sound of the Himalayas for those of you who are curious about Bhutan. Just take a moment to be comfortable on your seat, and we're going to get grounded for a moment. If you're holding on to anything, either literally or metaphorically, just let it go for a moment. Your to-do list, your pen, your cup of coffee, and just be present on your seat and with this moment. Just invite you to connect with your breath, with the gentle ease in and outflow of your breath. Become aware of your body. We often forget that we are actually graced with a body. Extending some appreciation to your body. Allow your awareness to extend to your seat, which is connected to the floor, which is connected to the ground, and ultimately connected to this beautiful Mother Earth. Allow your awareness to take in the space above your head and even beyond the ceiling, the sky, and the vastness of space. And in the joining point between the earth and the sky is your body and your human heart. And just an invitation to be present and to take in with awareness all of us on the Zoom call. And an invitation to connect with each other with a spirit of welcoming and curiosity. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about my own journey towards Bhutan and GNH. And I'd like to share a few slides and some visuals that might help us in the next minutes and hours that we have together, to paint a little bit of a story about how one begins getting interested in well-being economics and well-being. So as Ted mentioned, I am trained as a medical doctor and actually was born in Canada, trained at the University of Manitoba, and began as a medical doctor in North America, but had the opportunity to make an early detour to rural South Africa. This was around the time of the 90s when Nelson Mandela was bringing a huge sense of hope, but also a very different pandemic. The HIV pandemic was really wreaking havoc across the continent. And I was confronted with a level of material poverty that I had not experienced before as a middle-class Canadian. And with a sense of really kind of despair at the limitations of my medical tools, but also experiencing a kind of resilience and even exuberance in the nurses that I was training in HIV and TB care. After our workshops, there would be a real celebration and a gathering. And I was struck by how I could move from doing HIV surveys where we focused on poverty to a space where the often female head of the household would offer me a cup of tea and some bread, having just learned that there was not enough food in the house for the kids. So again, I was moving from the space of material poverty to a space of spiritual generosity and richness that really touched me and made me ask some important questions about what is development and how is it related to well-being and happiness. At the same time, I was getting my Master's of Public Health at the University of London and kind of going back and forth between rural Africa and the Tube in London. And often I'd be trying to bring that energy of connection and community into the Tube and would try to make eye contact or start a conversation and would often be greeted with a kind of cold stare and a kind of suspicion, which again raised the question in my mind about what happens to our sense of needing each other and of connecting with each other as our lives speed up, as we become more so-called developed. All that became more than just a personal inquiry when I started working at United Nations Development Program in New York, where I was heading up a large international team and found myself again raising questions about what are we measuring and why is it that developed countries are held up as a standard and the model that developing countries should somehow be aspiring to move in that direction. And it was around that time that I also began to move inward myself into a meditation practice, both in order to deal with what suddenly became a very complex and fast-paced life in New York, and also to tune into my own sense of leadership in a very complex institution. The idea of connecting to my own sense of purpose and not be carried along by institutional agendas became a living question for me. And it was around that time I had the chance to meet the Prime Minister of Bhutan when he arrived in 2012 to propose to the global community a new development paradigm that would look at happiness and well-being as the purpose of development. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to join the GNH Center, which was just starting up as a national NGO at that time. And I've been there for the past 8 years, very much leaning in and listening and learning about this journey that Bhutan has been on. So I want to begin by just giving a nod to some of our Club of Rome members who I was listening to very closely in a series of talks we had recently on this conversation of well-being. And David Korten, who is actually with us today, has really commented on the deep system failure that we are experiencing right now, and that actually marginal adjustments on the side are not going to do. We really need a transformation in our understanding of the nature and purpose of life and what it means to be human, and really create together an ecological civilization. I also had the chance to hear Mamphela Ramphele and John Gilmore speak about the amazing work that's happening in South Africa around LEAP schools. And Mamphela really raising the question, how do we tap into our deep spirit and wisdom and bring this to African leaders and others, thinking about these principles and leadership? And Carlos Alvarez also speaking about how do we bring together ancient wisdom and the best of modern science as we think into these deep questions. David again picked up this theme when he was speaking about Ubuntu, I am because you are, as a real way of bringing to life this idea of our interdependence and shifting from an economics and an egonomics that's very self-centered towards an economical system that's based on ecology and connection. My well-being depends on your well-being, and therefore I do best when we all do well. And finally, other colleagues in our Club of Rome family, Ndidi and Nora Bateson, have talked about the importance of storytelling when we talk about impact, and not just looking at hard empirical data, but also warm living data as a way of shaping how we think about change. So I'll be referring to some of these ideas as we go through our session today. And really the intention is to share some of the emerging lessons from Bhutan based on a systems thinking perspective, to look at well-being economies as a focal point for thinking not just about the outer systems change, but inner transformation, the leadership and self-leadership that might be required for us to move to a new economic paradigm. also to speak about awareness-based systems change, as a phrase some of us may not be familiar with, but really cultivating a capacity to sense ourselves as part of the larger system, as a way of co-creating an emerging future. And then finally, I'd love for us to spark a little bit of exploration around what does this mean beyond Bhutan? This is a Canadian and USA communities looking at these issues. What are the seeds of possibility in our own contexts? And here I'm really glad that we're joined by many of the guests that Charles alluded to. So a bit about the systems perspective. The iceberg model I find really helpful in that we know that we only see about 1/7 of the iceberg above the surface, and we're often not aware of what is underneath that. And if you think about it in terms of what preoccupies our attention in the news, the headlines that are grabbing us, it's often about the visible behaviors and symptoms in our society. But what doesn't show up are the structures and systems that are supporting them. And even below that, the narratives, the mental models that shape the systems, the society we create. And what's hardly ever referenced is the sources of our inspiration. What are our vision, our values and mindsets that we bring into the systems that we create? And one of the founding thinkers in the Club of Rome, a great systems thinker, Donella Meadows, pointed to this quite a while ago when she said that because mindsets and paradigms guide our behaviors, actually changing them can have a profound impact. That if we're able to hit that leverage point of paradigm, we can actually transform the system. So I'd like us to try to keep that in mind as we think about Bhutan and GNH. Otto Scharmer from the Presence Institute has taken this thinking even further in crystallizing the multiple crises that we're experiencing now into three that you could think about as an ecological disconnect, a disconnect from our sense of self and nature, a social disconnect between ourselves and others, whether that's the rising inequalities or isolation, loneliness that we're experiencing, and a spiritual disconnect, our sense of who we are at the moment and our highest aspirations, our sense of purpose. So it's interesting that speaking about stories and narratives, the story of GNH really begins almost in a mythical way with a visionary fourth king of Bhutan. And when he was asked in the 1970s, what is the gross national product of Bhutan? He answered that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, coining this phrase that was really placing the purpose of the country's development around happiness rather than chasing the growth of the economy as the neighbors, India and China, were doing at that time. Interesting that around the same time, 1968, a young senator, Robert Kennedy, was on the campaign trail and made a now famous speech, which you can find on the internet, where he says that gross national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And I know there's quite a few folks on this call who actually know a great deal about this issue about GDP growth and why it's being critiqued at this moment. But just to summarize some of what's being discussed in this present moment, you know, the history of GNP, which later became GDP, it served a function in the 1940s as we were coming out of the Great Depression and was useful for predicting fluctuations in economic growth. But Simon Kuznets, who was the architect of this measure, actually never intended it to be taken as a reflection of how a country is doing, how successful it is in the way that it's now being used. And you could summarize some of the problems with GDP as an indicator in three main clusters: what it counts, what it fails to count, and what it hides. So it counts only marketed economic activity, and all this leads to a positive growth in the number, even if we know that it's, for example, contributing to more pollution or more illness in society. What it fails to count are a lot of the things that actually are very important for a sense of well-being, but are outside the market. So the time we spend caring for children, caring for elders, time in nature that where we're not paying an entrance fee, these things are not calculated in GDP. And what's really problematic and becoming very apparent these days is that GDP growth can continue to escalate even while inequalities are rising. So this turns to why measure something different. And I'm often asked, what do you mean by happiness when you talk about GNH? And I love this definition from the first Prime Minister of Bhutan, where he really points out it's not just these moods that we have from time to time when we're feeling happy or elated, because those pass, those come and go. It's actually quite a profound definition where he speaks about true abiding or lasting happiness. It can't exist while others suffer and comes only from serving others, living in harmony with nature, and realizing our innate wisdom. So clearly very different from the sense of hedonia. Also apparent that well-being is deeply relational. We're talking about healing those three disconnects that I mentioned earlier: disconnect from ourselves, from others, and from nature. It really resonates with the ubuntu principle I mentioned earlier, because my well-being depends on your well-being. It's not actually a zero-sum game. And it counters this myth of homo economicus, which is really an idea of how human beings are or should be under a GDP-based model, because happiness here is not a competition, and we're all thriving when we move together in a well-being economy. So how do we move towards well-being economies? Looking at Bhutan, it begins with an outer transformation in terms of the system measuring the things that matter. And here it's creating an enabling environment for well-being through a survey that includes the 9 domains you see there and 33 indicators. And the 9 domains include aspects like living standards, health, and education, which most countries measure and which we would all agree are building blocks for well-being. But it goes beyond that and measures some of the more intangible aspects that research is now showing us are very important for our sense of well-being, particularly in more developed countries. Time use. What is our time use and work-life balance like? Do we know our neighbors? Are our communities vital and thriving? Is there a sense of cultural diversity and resilience? These are all measured in the GNH survey and are seen as interdependent, not one above and beyond the others. So a lot of this could seem quite theoretical. So I would really invite you to grab a paper and pen if you have one handy. If you don't, you can still go through this mini GNH survey as I read through the questions. But really it's to give you a sense of what these 9 domains might capture. It's adapted from the Bhutan survey so that you could imagine doing it, for example, in an organization or in your community. So here, consider 0 as a very poor score and 10 being the top of the charts. And just consider how you would rate yourself on these different questions. So starting with health, my lifestyle supports good physical and mental health. Just give yourself a score there from 0 to 10. And don't overthink it. Just go with your instinct on this question. Second question on living standards. I feel confident I have enough financial security to meet my needs and those of my family. So interesting here that we're not asking about a set number, but your confidence around your financial security. So just score yourself on that one. Education. I have enough learning opportunities to meet the shifting challenges in my professional career. This is one that's important to many people in their careers, in their workplaces. Number 4 would be environment. In my workplace, there's high awareness and responsibility towards the environment. Number 5, community vitality. When I faced a personal crisis, I felt I had enough support from my friends and community. And I think COVID has been a very strong example of many of us having to rely on community in ways we haven't in the past. Time use. I have enough time to do the things I enjoy with friends and family. So again, give yourself a score on that one. Number 7, psychological well-being. I feel there's good alignment between my sense of life purpose and my work. Again, a very important question in many organizations, and one that's often maybe changes at different points in your career. Good governance. In my country, I feel that there is a good level of transparency and trust in leadership. And again, this is one where in many countries where GDP growth has been strong, there's been a real unraveling in the sense of trust in government. And when that happens, well-being surveys start to decline. And last question, cultural diversity and resilience. Where I live, cultural diversity is seen as a positive contribution to society. And again, no need to point out the relevance of this in many cities and countries at this moment. So I hope you've had a chance to maybe take a little bit of a gauge of your own sense of well-being using the 9 domains, again, adapted from the G&H survey to give you a sense of how this comes down to real life experience. So I want to share a little bit more on the G&H survey and how it's being used in Bhutan, and then we'll have a chance to discuss and share a little bit. I think an important principle in G&H is the notion of sufficiency. So within each of those 9 domains in the survey, there is a cutoff point that is set where a person would be considered to be sufficient in that domain. So let's say it's living standards or good governance. The way they answer it, if they get this percentage of questions that are scored at this level within that domain, they're considered to be happy. And then out of the 9 domains as a whole, there's a happiness threshold where if you score sufficiently in 6 out of the 9 domains, then you would be considered to be happy. So again, that leaves room for variation and differences between people. And it raises the idea that, that it's not about maximizing all of them and making sure that everybody gets 100%, but looking at the distribution and sufficiency within and between groups. So that was the outer transformation, the systems change aspect of G&H. I want to talk a little bit about the inner transformation. And here it's about vision and mindsets and cultivating capacities, as I mentioned earlier, beginning with redefining the purpose of the economy and really moving from chasing GDP growth to promoting equity and sustainability and well-being. In Bhutan, also, there's an emphasis that's supported by the traditional Buddhist culture of really cultivating awareness and insight into the interconnectedness of life and really trying to nourish from a very early age altruistic behaviors that are rooted in compassion and generosity. The 5th king of Bhutan, who is very popular even as the country moved to a constitutional democracy, has spoken of leadership of the self. And whenever he speaks to college graduates, he talks about the importance of really leading lives that are guided by these values, which he himself tries to live in his own role as the leader. There's a strong sense of community and a culture of volunteers. The DESUT, the executive director of our G&H Center, is one of these volunteers. And I watched her go through the training process, really preparing to, if there's an emergency, be called up and to help whatever is happening in the country. And recently they were all called in to help with the COVID pandemic. And for those of you who have caught the news on Bhutan making a lot of the headlines on its remarkable response to COVID, only 2 deaths since the start of the pandemic, and a response that's been driven by civil society mobilizing, for example, to sew masks for rural areas, farmers donating food for those who are in quarantine, bringing together the best of scientific research and leadership. So really looking at contact tracing and testing, and also consulting spiritual leaders to really bring the 2 together. For example, deciding when the vaccination date should be in consultation with those leaders. The result of when you bring those 2 dimensions together is they were able to vaccinate 93% of eligible adults within 2 weeks. And they started not with the oldest person, but with what the astrologist suggested, a woman born in the year of the monkey, meaning she was 30 years old, vaccinated by a woman also born in the year of the monkey. and ending with the king, who wanted to be the last person to be vaccinated because he wanted to see people be protected. So interesting approach to that pandemic. Not enough just to have vision, not enough even just to have a survey that takes place every 3 years. In Bhutan, they have set up a G&H commission, which screens policies and development plans with those 9 domains in order to see if, for example, a mine is proposed, what will be its impact, not just on income and environment, but on health, on community, on income disparity, and then sending it back to be revised if those domains are not measuring up well. And again, it could seem very top down. So the G&H Center, my organization in Bhutan, is really about applying it in daily life, leadership development, business, education, civil society, and increasingly international engagement, as we're doing here. So if you take those together, you see we're getting at that iceberg model below that surface, starting with the vision and values in the country and the leadership, again, shaping the structures and systems through the survey, the policymaking tool, and then shaping the larger well-being culture and society. So just some examples, if you were to go to Bhutan, you would notice some of the absence of marketing and advertising because there's actually a ban on billboard advertising, and nature and its own beauty really stands forward. They're prioritizing caring for people, universal free basic health and education, and they just made teachers and healthcare workers the highest paid civil servants in the country. Many of you may know of Bhutan as being the first carbon negative country in the world, actually pulling out more carbon from the atmosphere than they're putting out. They've committed in their constitution to keep at least 60% of their forests under protection for all time. I think they're at around 72% right now. And again, connection to the inner aspect, the spiritual dimension, mountaineering was opened up in '94 up to a certain limit in 6,000 meters. But interestingly, despite its lucrative income in terms of tourism, it was actually banned in 2003 because of the feeling that, again, nature is sacred. It is the domain of spirits, and it needs to be preserved. Again, that's reflected in their high value, low impact tourism, learning perhaps from countries like Nepal next door that they need to balance tourism income with the impacts on society and environment. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the cultural shift, the introduction of meditation and G&H values in education. All this to say, Bhutan is not without its challenges. And the latest survey in Bhutan showed that farmers as an occupational group were less happy than others, women less happy than men, and Bhutanese youth for the first time less happy than other age groups. And so again, that should point the government as policymakers to ask the questions, what can we be doing differently? And there have been responses including really focusing on improving rural infrastructure, really trying to tackle women's empowerment and political participation, really looking at engaging youth and exposure to social media, unemployment, globalization, and strengthening the role of CSOs in business and promoting G&H. And then just to say that the leadership in Bhutan are very humble. I'm always touched by the fact that they kind of push back on the Shangri-La myths that many people have about Bhutan. As the Prime Minister of Bhutan would say, you know, this isn't a country that has attained G&H and now puts it like a trophy on the shelf. Like most countries, we are struggling with the basic challenges of meeting basic needs. But what separates us from many other countries is that we've made happiness the foundation of human needs as a goal of social change. And as one of the ministers said, this is a dialogue with the rest of the world. We can't be a G&H bubble in a GDP world. And hence much of the international interest and engagement in Bhutan continues. So I want to pause there and maybe invite us to, with Charles' guidance, unpack some of these ideas and share a little bit. So over to you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. So I'm sure there are many questions, and there will be an opportunity to hear questions. By all means, encourage you again to put questions in the chat as they arise. We are going to go into a breakout group right now, though, and our invitation to you is reflecting on the exercise that Julia had you do with the 9 domains questions, which, as she has highlighted, is such a core component, and there's so much more to how it's used in Bhutan, but is such a core component to the work of the GNH. We thought we'd use that as kind of a starting point for you to have a conversation with 3 others. You're going to be in groups of 4. So our invitation is to introduce yourself very briefly, and to share what struck you. What did you notice? Anything that surprised you when you completed the 9 questions. So you're going to get a little invitation that's going to come across your screen in just a minute. You're only going to have about 8 minutes, so it's going to be a short conversation. And again, the question is, what did you notice? What struck you when you responded to the 9 questions in the 9 domain survey? So invite you to turn your cameras on time for a, it may have been a wish that it was the last. I hope not. We would be really, really interested to hear just a couple of brief comments about what struck you from your conversation. And again, just a reminder, if you've got specific questions that are emerging for Julia, please put those in the chat for right now. We will have a live opportunity for that shortly. But right now, we'd just like to hear anything that struck you from your small group conversation as you met others and reflected on the 9 domains exercise.
I could say something, Charles.
Well, thank you.
Yes. Well, all 3 of us who are in the group have lost trust in government. So that's one thing that was common.
Interesting. And yet, how often do we hear the refrain, we need policy, we need government to do X? It's interesting. Anitra, go ahead.
Yes, David Hutton, who was in my group, I congratulate thoroughly because he's going after corruption in government. And I find that one of the most appalling and difficult points for well-being because it siphons off so much funds, particularly from the very poor, and food and trust and many other things that need for good governance. And I congratulate his whole groups who are doing this whistleblowing and anti-corruption. And of course, I was commenting on the need for getting over the ecological disconnect and the spiritual disconnect, which has to do with not understanding our place in the food web as small creatures who are totally dependent on plants for their oxygen, for their water accumulation, for their food and other things. And if we only didn't have our entitlements and our sense of superiority, we wouldn't have degraded the earth as we have now. So that's what we discussed.
Beautiful. Thanks, Anitra. And I'm tempted to ask David to share with us, but that'll maybe be for another session, what he's doing with government corruption. Maybe one more brief comment before Julia takes us into our next.
Sid, can you summarize this responsibility theme that you raised, which Ray and I agree with, I think? Okay.
John, that was a request for who?
Well, when we discussed the 9 domains, it was interesting that we zeroed in a little bit about the lack of real action by our own government, who is good on promising. And then Ted said, well, maybe we need a domain which rates the sense of responsibility. And I think Ray had already, there were just 3 of us in the group. And so the idea of responsibility to go along with promises.
We came up with the term gross national responsibility to see whether or not that might be a measurable counterpoint to, because most of us were having a rough time saying bad things about the other ones. So we live in a pretty darn good place.
Yeah.
All right, super. Well, let's, Julia, dive a little bit a little bit deeper into the G&H work.
Yeah,
Part
thank
two
you.
of this.
Thank you, Charles. So hopefully that initial mini survey gave folks a sense of those 9 domains. And it sounds like good governance, or the lack thereof, really resonated with people. I want to turn to a different perspective now and broaden it out into what does well-being economies mean in our own countries and contexts. And again, coming back to this idea of the combination of inner and outer transformation as being very important in that respect. Why do we need a shift in consciousness in our own cultures, in our own countries? What are we up against? And reclaiming our attention, awareness-based systems change. So as David alluded to in one of our conversations at the Club of Rome, we're not actually operating in a neutral space. Our cultural map is actually flawed and yet reinforced by the media and other forces. And it's almost as if we were trying to dehumanize ourselves and separate ourselves from each other and from nature. Interesting remark from an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist in 1984, Pierre Bourdieu, really pointing out that class status is really gained, lost, and reproduced through our everyday acts as consumers, as shoppers, and that our consumption practices are really maintaining these basic structures of power and inequality which now characterize our world. This was quoted in a paper, How Unequal Does It Feel, by Adam Lerner, who I'm happy to see is also part of our call today, in his commentary on looking at how consumer status and affirmation has become one of the only ways for us as individuals to exercise power and agency in our complex lives these days. We're consuming often not because we need something, but as an aspirational response, one that we may not even be aware of. As a result, breaking our consumption habits is proving extremely difficult. And the painful irony of this is that our increased income and consumption in our wealthy countries have actually brought very little to no benefit in terms of our sense of well-being, while simultaneously devastating our planet. And so this raises a really important question about how can we go beyond our individual acts of voluntary simplicity to tackling some of the deeper politics of consumption. And what is the shift in consciousness and the systems change levers that would be required to do that? In terms of our sense of consciousness and our ability to be aware of what's going on, I wanted to highlight some very interesting research published in Science. And the title of the article is A Distracted Mind is an Unhappy Mind. And this group of Harvard researchers actually used a smartphone app to track volunteers at various points in their day to say, how happy are you at the moment? What are you currently doing? Were you thinking about your current activity or about something else? And what they found was a little bit shocking. On average, we spend about almost half of our waking hours thinking about something other than what we're doing. And this mind wandering is actually making us feel unhappy. In fact, mind wandering itself is an excellent predictor of our sense of unhappiness, and it's a better predictor than the actual activity we're engaged in. So it's not so much whether you are doing the dishes at home or you're having a dinner at a great restaurant with somebody that you love. It's whether you're actually present with and connected with that activity in a meaningful way, or whether your mind is completely somewhere else. And we've all had that experience ourselves. What is concerning is that research is showing that in, for example, the United States, kids are now spending upwards of 7 hours a day gazing at their screens. So again, raising this question of what is the level of consciousness that we are cultivating in its ability to connect with well-being. A lot of interesting commentaries and research now looking at values, mindsets, and consciousness and how they are being cultivated or manipulated in our current society, and to reflect on what this means if we were to try to move towards a well-being economy. Many are pointing out that we need to actually decolonize our minds from what is becoming more and more an addiction to consumerism and to the distorted mindsets and habit-driven behaviors created by neoliberal economics. We have to reclaim our attention and detox from what is a constant barrage of distraction, outright manipulation, to be masters rather than puppets of our expanding technology. And I point to Social Dilemma, if folks have had a chance to see that documentary, again, reclaiming our attention as part of moving towards well-being. And again, referring to the deep cultural roots of many traditions, including on the lands we sit on now, to cultivate our highest human potential, to really draw on these wisdom traditions of Ubuntu. In Bhutan, they would speak of the Bodhisattva. First Nations would speak about seventh generation thinking. Ego to eco-consciousness is a more modern way of doing it. Expanding basically our sense of self so that we see ourselves as part of a whole. We have to be able to strengthen our capacity to expand our time horizons while taking action now, even if the results will not be visible on my watch. And this is critical for people in leadership roles in important sectors like banking and finance, where a lot of the changes and the metrics are based on this quarter. And yet we have to be able to make decisions on a longer time horizon. It's also critical for taking care of ourselves and not burning out, to be able to identify with goals that may not be visible in our lifetime. And of course, to do that, we have to generate the courage and the imagination and the will to step into something that is emerging and unknown, rather than making the comfortable incremental cosmetic changes that are actually just propping up failing systems. So again, the importance of the inner transformation for well-being economy. Fortunately, we're living at an exciting time where ancient wisdom and modern science are coming together around some very interesting findings on our ability to cultivate this capacity. Neuroplasticity coming out of the field of neuroscience, the fact that our brains actually start to be shaped functionally to wire together more along activities that we practice on a constant level. And that includes the cultivation of meta-awareness or meditative awareness. That ability to be aware of what we're doing can be trained and is actually linked to a lot of health and well-being benefits. Our ability to cope with stress and to have greater resilience, really being able to sustain positive emotions, to bounce back from negative emotions, to cultivate altruism and pro-social behaviors, to the extent that Dr. Richard Davidson, who has been pioneering much of this research, says we're now thinking about exercising our minds in the same way we used to think about exercising our bodies and going to the gym. They have really distilled a lot of the neuroscience to 4 pillars of well-being and implementing it in organizations and businesses as leadership and training programs. Awareness, again, that ability to be present. Connection, appreciation, cultivating compassion. Insight into how our minds work. What are the narratives and stories we tell ourselves? And again, purpose, values, principles, and how do we maintain that motivation even amidst really difficult situations? So more and more we're seeing awareness-based systems change as a way of bringing these 2 aspects together. And again, responding to Mamphela's question, how do we bring the best of these both worlds together? In leadership capacities to address these complex social, environmental, and spiritual crises that we're facing, and in supporting a shift in consciousness from the ego to the ecosystem awareness. So it's not all about fear. What do I have to lose by this system changing? But actually, what do we stand to gain by moving towards well-being economies collectively? We need baby steps. We need to have the safety to try and prototype and make mistakes and get back on our feet. I've had the opportunity to be involved in a few, the Global Wellbeing Lab with the Presencing Institute and the Global Leadership Academy, GIZ, the Right Livelihood and G&H program, which has been a collaboration with my center, Schumacher College in the UK, and this year with Windhorse Farm in Nova Scotia. Again, adapting these values and practices to one's own community or organization. Otto Sharma, again from the Presencing Institute, has quoted Bill O'Brien, former CEO of Hanover, who has said that actually the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So again, cultivating the shift in consciousness and the leadership capacity of all of us, turning that telescope out from the galaxy back to our inner world. More and more science showing how this can be done, and cultivating 3 intelligences, not just the intelligence of the intellect, which most of us have experienced through our conventional education system, but the open mind, the ability to move from judgment towards curiosity when something new comes across our plate. To move from a feeling of cynicism, this will never work, there's not enough time, to one of compassion. How can we work together to co-create this future? And letting go of fear, which is driving a lot of our behavior at the moment, to one of courage and the open will to embrace the challenges ahead. A lot of this doesn't mean holding on to the current systems and holding on tighter. It actually means letting go of what is holding us back and letting come what is emerging, what we can't yet define. When Bhutan started the journey towards GNH, it wasn't all laid out clearly in the way that I expressed. It's been coming into visibility and manifestation through experience and practice over the years. And the center has been trying to build on that. As I mentioned, we're a nonprofit NGO. We're fortunate to have the Princess of Bhutan as our patron. And again, applying and adapting GNH through leadership, both in the East and in the West, working in the fields of education, because it seems a very important leverage point for this shift in consciousness, increasingly working and consulting with various businesses, and also more and more being drawn to speak to banking and finance leadership, again, in Asia, also here in North America, around merchant banking in South Africa, because there's a lot of interest in the new measures and in the consciousness shift. Again, the approach always about transformative leadership development and the systems change. And again, with some of our graduates of prior leadership programs like the Right Livelihood, the consciousness shift being expressed in quotes like learning to practice boldness, realizing that to change is to become more of who we are. And some of the prototypes that they've been encountering and developing, cultivating silent spaces and gardens across the UK that people are off their mobile devices and actually connecting with nature, applying GNH principles in a horticultural apprenticeship program in Rhode Island, redesigning a curriculum in engineering to look at sustainable technologies and learning from each other, students cooperating with each other rather than competing, and an Asian venture philanthropy event on sustainable finance. So again, prototyping these initiatives. I just want to conclude by throwing out some examples and seeds that I see happening and arising in the midst of this COVID crisis. Many of us on this call are well aware of Wellbeing Economy Alliance. They are supporting governments and civil society in an increasing number of countries to start moving towards a well-being economy. Canada being one of the countries that has recently become a member. Many of us will be familiar with Kate Raworth's chart-breaking work with donut economics and the labs that are taking it to the city level, Amsterdam, Melbourne, San Francisco, and the list is growing. So again, not having to implement it at a national level, but starting with smaller bite-sized chunks where the experience can be gained. A bit closer to home, I was happy to see that we have Tara Campbell from David Suzuki Foundation on the call. They will be speaking in 2 weeks' time for this CACOR group, talking about how they're starting as a new initiative, a Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Wellbeing Economies Alliance Canada, and hats off to the best acronym, We All Can. Engage Nova Scotia, I was happy to see that Danny has joined, Danny Graham, who's been leading some really interesting work applying a survey looking at quality of life with domains very similar to Bhutan's in Nova Scotia to try and see how that can start to shift what's happening in that province. Mark Anielski been doing some very interesting work with some of our First Nations around well-being surveys here in Canada. And I've been in discussions with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, one of the largest health funding organizations in the US, on how do we expand well-being economy thinking in the US and Canada through this idea of projects and seeds and cultivating the beginnings of innovation. So I love this quote from Fritjof Capra, where he takes a kind of future looking backward view, a historian of the future looking at this crisis of COVID that we are sitting in the midst of now, and saying that the future historians may actually conclude that even though COVID had widespread devastating consequences for all of us, it may have saved humanity and large parts of the community of life from extinction if we make the choices that we're being invited to make now. So I want to conclude with that somewhat hopeful and challenging vision of where we are, and to return to this idea that it is reconnecting the inner experience and the outer world that is really at the heart of well-being economics and GNH. Andreas Weber has said that the goal of leading a fuller life is the most important stepping stone toward changing our relationships with the animate earth and among ourselves. And if we adopt this perspective, we can see that something is sustainable if it enables more life for me and for all of us. It's crucial to discover the link between our inner experience and the external natural order. So I'll bring us back to our group here, but just to recap briefly, we walked through some of the emerging lessons from Bhutan. From a systems perspective, we talked about the importance of inner transformation as well as outer systems change, awareness-based systems change, and how that's being implemented at different levels, and this invitation to think about planting seeds locally and how well-being economies might be activated at that level. So thank you, and I'll stop and hand over to Charles.
Thank you so much, Julia. So we're going to open this up for some questions. Right now, I see that from Peter Meinke and also from David Korten, Julia, there's a similar question around donut economics and the integration of donut economics with the Bhutan happiness indicators. So I'll ask you to respond to that. But for the rest of everyone here, please bring in some questions if you have them. We're going to take about 10 minutes, and then we're going to go back into the same groups we were in to explore a very specific question around what's evoked for you around possibility, local possibility for yourself in the context of what Julia's talked about, but I'll say more about the question shortly. Let's just open it up right now for some questions, starting with the first one from David and Peter. Julia.
Yeah, I love the idea of thinking beyond our own frameworks. And I've been a big fan of Kate's work on donut economics, and actually have been having some exploratory conversations also with David around what would it look like if we were to bring together donut economics and GNH in some way? What would they complement and bring out in each other? For me, the donut economics gives a great blueprint and plan for something that you can do at a city level, for example, that looks at staying within the planetary boundaries and also making sure that we don't let people fall through the social floor, that we're also taking care of quality of life to the extent that people can thrive. What I sense GNH might contribute to that is how that feels on a day-to-day level, to make the well-being aspect and the inner development, the leadership aspect come to life as we're moving towards a balanced donut economics model. So I think GNH brings in some of the social transformation skills and practices that I mentioned earlier. Also a bit more of a heart connection and a taste to what well-being economies could feel like as we're moving towards these goals and measures that the donut economics model puts forward. So that's a feeling. I would love to see people starting to try that and to be a part of that.
So maybe just staying on that theme of measurement, Jeff Schufelt raises this question in relation to the measurement every 3 years in Bhutan, what the trend has been, and maybe some comment on actions that it drives.
So I think the interesting thing that happens when the GNH survey comes out is there's often a breakdown and a granulation of the data. Some of it I presented in the last one around what's happening in age groups and around gender, and even by regions and rural and urban. So over the years, what's been noticeable are differences between rural and urban areas are becoming more pronounced. And it's leading to interesting discussions about how do we revitalize the rural communities so that it doesn't become a drain into the urban centers. And that is part of what's informing some of the work that we're doing at the center as well, also responding to the youth question. So young people for the first time being less happy than others. Because of COVID, the need for Bhutan to become more sustainable in terms of its food has led to revitalization of agriculture. Even people in my office at the GNH Center started gardening during the pandemic. And we started a program for young people that's connected with a university in the States that's going to be trying to cultivate GNH, what we're calling educated GNH farmers, where young people don't see farming as something of the past, but as something vital and linked to their own personal development now, and trying to partner with other youth groups globally to activate that. I think each year that the changes between the survey highlight the kind of questions that the policymakers need to focus on. And as I mentioned earlier, women's empowerment, farming, agriculture, young people, and or ones that really came forward this year.
Beautiful. I want to stay on this theme, but then circle back to Anitra's two great questions around the connection to the inner piece. But I think the question Adam's just raised relates to this theme of measurement and action. And his question, Julia, is: do you feel we should be openly having a direct dialogue about consumption, or do you feel that the shifts in consumption will occur by changing our cultural conditions of well-being?
Such an interesting one. I mean, I feel like the questions on consumption are going to come crashing down on our heads, whether we like it or not. And policy shifts may start to happen because of the climate crisis that we're in. That it seems much more prudent to be moving into that discussion willingly, and to be cultivating communities and cultures that are talking about it and embracing it, rather than waiting for it to come to us as a kind of feeling of deprivation and you can't do so much. To me, one of the advantages of the well-being economy, and maybe people felt it a little bit in doing the 9 domains, is you do get the sense of the trade-offs. If there is a little bit less in terms of living standards or consumption, what are we gaining in terms of time use and community? So I think having those discussions around consumption, not just from the point of view of poor me, what do I have to give up, but how is it tying my hands, and how is it constraining other aspects of well-being? And what would it look like if we were to voluntarily make those choices and those shifts? I think that's a really important point we're at right now.
And if faced with or presented the question that Art raises, how do you respond? How much is this going to cost to actually do that? And I'm sure you've heard a bit of that in Bhutan.
How much is it going to cost to
do this?
Such an interesting question. I mean, it's almost, I would say, how much has it cost to get us here? So the transition of moving away from the current economic system, I don't think it's an economic question in terms of what is it going to cost us. It's really a question of what are we going to start valuing and measuring in its place. The trick of this question is we keep coming back to the GDP-based model. It's almost in the same way that we're oftentimes giving a GDP or dollar value to things that we should be instead counting their value and contribution to our quality of life. So I don't think it's like there's going to be a dollar bill cost to moving from a GDP-based economy to a well-being economy.
Which really kind of comes full circle back to this inner question. And I love how Anitra's offered this. She said, you know, in terms of this superiority over nature and environment, that we are in fact superior. How do we go further on this inner shift?
Reminds me of a conversation you and I had yesterday, Charles, and a reflection from a colleague of ours on how, as modern people, we have become really separated from our bodies and from the earth. And in some ways, this consciousness shift is not something we can think ourselves through. It's not even something I can talk to you about on the Zoom call, although we're trying to give a taste of it. It's a way of reconnecting, and there are practices and ways of doing that to our bodies and to nature, and that consciousness shift starts to happen of its own accord. I would say we're feeling that consciousness shift now in the pain that we're experiencing. We've seen higher rates of suicide in our developed countries, in our urban settings, among young people across the world. That is in many ways reflecting the lack of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, and to nature that we're talking about. So it's not that we are unaware that we are connected. We're feeling the pain of that disconnect at the moment. So the question then becomes, how do we shift our organizations, our cities, our ways of life, our educational systems to bring that reconnection back? And I think there are many interesting seeds of that are happening.
Beautiful.
Can I put in a word here? Can you hear me?
Please, Anitra, go
Yes.
ahead.
The word is simple revisioning ourselves with everything that we know, both from the ancient wisdom that Mamphela talks about and the present wisdom of science, that we are simply a spectrum going from the microorganisms in the earth and in our bodies and in the sea, through the animals and plants, including those dinosaurs and things that have become extinct. But it's clear that plants were here first, and plants created the oxygen that is now being taken away because we're overpopulated, and the oxygen was necessary before the animals came. And if we can see ourselves in time and space, having gotten rid of 85% of all ecosystems on the face of the terrestrial earth and 50% in the sea, and we see ourselves next to the small plants, then we'll see ourselves in reality, what and who we are. It has to be a vision at the beginning, but many indigenous cultures believed in this completely, and they understood where they were, and they prayed to the buffalo or the bear that they were about to kill, that it was necessary to get their family through the winter to kill them. And they understood they were part of the food web and part of the whole rolling of nature. And if we would be teaching that, and in these inner exercises feeling the wisdom of the many religions who have this in their early histories, then we would have a much sounder system on which we could make these transitions and decisions about where we're going to take the earth and the human beings.
Thanks, Anitra.
Thank you, Anitra.
We have one other question, and then Julie, I'm going to suggest we turn this into I'm actually going to ask you to comment a little bit on some of the G&H programs and how you run them and the importance of these dialogue conversations, which in a way we're trying to emulate or simulate here. But before we go there, John Legg asks a question as relates to Rachel Carlson's limits to growth around population and consumption, and any reflections you might have on that.
You know, I think we know that the limits to growth has been getting a lot of attention lately. And I think many of the principles that were put forward are very relevant now. And the conversation around population is always fraught and difficult. But I think there are many ways to talk about it in terms of its link to consumption as well. So I think it's happening. These conversations are happening. I know that the Club of Rome globally is really looking at revisiting limits to growth and to having these dialogues in terms of what it means for us now. The consumption argument conversation, I think, needs to happen very much in our wealthier developed countries. I think it's been put on the table very soundly by a small virus called COVID. Most of us had to slow down and to figure out what was really important to us and what was extraneous during this time. Some people are jumping right back into business as usual and consumption as usual. Others have made huge shifts in their lifestyle. Others are contemplating it. I think it's a huge moment. Wellbeing Economies Alliance, who I spoke about earlier, are putting together lots of different ways of addressing it. Many businesses are looking at it now because of COVID-19. So I think there are really opportunities to act on that now in a serious way. And again, communities like this, where we're coming together to discuss and to share lessons, is one way to start.
It also, I think, relates to, and perhaps Julie, if you have any insights to share on this, I saw a question from Ted around how we both define and exchange stories of success and the importance of stories.
Yeah, that's my favorite way of talking about these issues too, Charles, is that the data is important and census surveys, quantitative is important, but it should always be the jumping off point for the stories. So even when a GNH survey comes out or a similar survey is done in an organization, that's not the end of it. It should then prompt stories and questions about why is it this way and what are the possibilities of changing. And to do that, it means listening. So it also means shifting some of the ways that we make decisions and the ways that we talk about. So even in the way that you and I wanted to host this session today, I was quite sure I didn't want to do it just standing at the PowerPoint and giving up my version of how I think GNH is, but to really open it up to the experience of the people who are on this call, many of who have years of experience and many who are at the cutting edge of doing this. So you asked earlier about how the GNH Center runs programs. It's very much about that. It's about introducing the concepts, having people be familiar with the measures, clarifying the vision, and then turning the mirror inwards. So it's not just about how do I change this in my organization or my business or my community, but what are the changes and the mindsets and the behaviors that I could and can and wish to change in myself. So the two are connected. The consciousness shift begins at home, and it gets strengthened by action in your own home, your own family and relationships, and then it spreads out into organization as well. So we're constantly weaving in and out that Mobius loop metaphor, inner transformation, systems change. They support each other.
Beautiful. So let's use that as a jumping off point for one more brief conversation in our groups. And the groups are going to be a little bit different because we've had, as you've all seen in the chat, a number of people who have dropped off. But the question, Julie and I would like to pose is, what's been sparked as you reflect on what Julie has shared around the importance of awareness-based systems change, that awareness beginning with the internal understanding and seeing our own internal condition. What's been sparked for you? What's been evoked in terms of a possibility that you see for yourself, for your work, for the community that you're a part of, whether that be your organization, your household, your neighborhood, your country, your region? But what's a possibility? And that might be in the form of a question or something that has been sparked or touched in you. So we're going to put you back into groups. Again, they are going to be a little bit different because, and as I say it, I'm madly reconstituting them because we've had a few people leave. And you're going to get an invitation that's going to come on your screen momentarily. Be really curious to hear, and maybe just, if you want to share something, just raise your hand physically. Don't need to use the button at the bottom. What was evoked or emerged or a possibility that you heard? Barry, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I was in a small group with Ted and David, and I think the most often used word for a change in awareness, I think, that has been sparked by events was local. So hopefully, at least the three of us seem to be aware of the importance of local community, local economies, what we're a local paper that was very effective at getting out messages. The idea that people live within their means wherever they are on this planet locally, looking at local resources, rather than, we didn't use these words exactly, but it's almost the opposite of globalization. We now need to look at what's local to us, what the community is around us, what the resources are around us that best fit our needs.
Barry, while you're in the breakout groups, Julie and I had a delightful conversation with Art, and speaking of local, learned that he is completely off grid with a ground pump, heat pump with solar, and is now generating revenue and storing energy in his Tesla batteries and in the ground. I mean, talk about local possibility and opportunity. Ted.
I just want to reinforce just what we're on right now. I gave another presentation to the same group not long ago, and it was fully on the idea that it was from the bottom up. The community level is where you build from. And that even if you define something much larger, it ends up being delivered one community, one factory, one society at a time. And I think we sometimes miss that. And yet we are, of course, seeking the global panacea, but it's all made up of little parts. And I think we've got to pay attention to that and share it.
Beautiful.
I'm wondering if there isn't too much focus on government and waiting for government to do things. You know, we're always saying, why don't they do something? And I think instead we should say, why don't we do something? And maybe the role of governments is to help rather than, well, hopefully they would help. At least they should get out of the way.
That's what we'd all like.
Yeah, I don't think that they're able to lead. I think it's led from the bottom up.
I don't like doing this in groups, but because he's a dear friend, I'm going to, and because he's new to this group, and Julia referenced him in one of her quotes earlier. But my dear friend Adam Lerner, who is the author of something called The Understory, which Julia referenced, and I really encourage you check out. But I know Adam's been very engaged in local community here in Vancouver. Adam, maybe just invite you to share a little bit about your learnings and actions in that space.
Thank you. I'm humbled. I will just say that per your point, Barry, which you probably hopefully saw me vociferously nodding as you were sharing that, I was really interested in this question about our own self-interest, and really found incredible value in the work of Eleanor Ostrom, which many of you are probably very familiar with and have spent time with. And what Ostrom determined was not only were there case studies from all over the world in various generations and in various cultural contexts for collaborating and more effectively on the commons, but rather exactly what you're suggesting, which is that our very reliance on centralized institutions undergirds our possibilities as communities for surfacing what is actually our leadership possibilities. And so she gives these core design principles, which I think, and others, academics, et cetera, have built upon them in the past 10, 15 years since her passing. But I think that there's incredible wealth in what her core design principles and what has been built in recognizing and once again, like throwing away Hardin's tragedy of the commons to recognize that really it is the communal response. And if we create the structural conditions, we can have a very, very different kind of communal response, and what essentially could build up to a larger national, international response.
Thanks, Adam. Anyone else? Reflections or comments?
Yeah,
I just want to go back to Adam, if I could. Adam, we all know that Vancouver has been a forefront in trying to be the greenest city in the world, and has had a tremendous amount of success and coverage on that. Could you just tell us where that is now, and how you can see that whole realm folding into what we've been talking about? Because a lot of the things that have made that a success are in fact operations at the community level, and people in fact addressing more than just how much it costs and what the profits are. It's very timely. Could you comment on that?
I'm not sure I'm qualified, and I'll let Charles or maybe add to this, but I would just suggest that the learnings here, and I think that we've looked through the C40 initiative and the Thriving Cities, look to cities that could be demonstration cities for others to scale impact. And I guess where my head's at and what I've been reviewing is that the responses need to be bioregional specific, and rather it's not about implementing and scaling from one city to the next as much as a regional response. And I would say in that sense, we don't have, we can look to, the green policy decisions that have been made over the past 10, 20 years in Vancouver that set up that leadership standard. But I would argue that our corporations that are the main corporations that are part of the city, such as the Lululemon, are no more a part of contributing to our community and contributing to our resilience, our regenerative ecosystem than in any other place. And so I think we struggle from exactly the same challenges. What on the face may look like leadership, I don't think that the community structure, whether you're talking about the civic structures, the corporate structures, are any different than you would find in most places in the world, unfortunately. Charles, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think Julia Julia, was it an invitation to Danny on this topic?
Yeah, maybe just to say, I think we've got both coasts covered here. We have Danny joined us from Engage Nova Scotia, who I also mentioned has been doing a quality of life survey and really looking at how to influence policy and government towards well-being economies from that side. So I think it'd be a nice counterpoint to what Adam just shared. Danny, welcome.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, everyone. I've really enjoyed these 2 hours to sort of hear the perspectives of everyone. And I think I have to say, especially delightful always to spend time with Julia and to listen to her perspectives. And maybe I'll circle back to that. I'll just describe very briefly that our small non-for-profit likes to consider ourselves to be at the intersection of the public, the private, the academic, and the community sectors. And we're advancing a quality of life initiative province-wide with 9 local leadership teams in each region of the province. And it's something that we're iterating towards with a 230 question survey with 13,000 Nova Scotians having responded to it. And we're sort of creating the opportunity to sort of imagine and reimagine, especially at this time when we're incubating through the pandemic, richer questions about what matters most as individuals and as a collective, whether we want to continue in the direction we've been going in for a long period of time, or whether we take this pause and actually find a way to pivot to something that better reflects, again, what matters most. I'm not sure if I'll be able to sort of add much to the richness of what has been said before, except to say, to repeat something that I had shared in the group that a few of us were in just a few moments ago. And that is that, just like GDP was seen for so long to be the dominant commentary, a subject of discussion for how a successful society advances over the last 50 years at least. I have a concern that we become myopically focused on just the systems themselves, as much as I am deeply wanting systems change to happen. And what I'm increasingly interested in is the intersection between our concerns about all the systems, economic, political, environmental, and all the rest. All in, I see those at sort of that middle realm between the everything, existential kinds of things that we know to be real but are hard to grasp, and the personal stuff, the psychological, behavioral things that sort of cause us as individuals to behave in a certain way. And so the plea that I have is for us to better integrate, or at least fuse, because there's a lot of work, and it's commendable that so many conversations are starting to emerge. But if I were to invite a perspective about something, it is that we not just focus on the systems and what's wrong with the systems without doing what Julia does as good a job as anybody I've spent time with articulating, is that it's not going to stick and it won't be internalized individually or collectively unless we do the difficult work that is internal. And sort of reconcile ourselves to ourselves and our place in this broader, amazing biosphere, amongst others. And once we do that and we connect up to the systems, then we have reference points that guide us, and we create more, if you will, osmosis across the paths, so that it's not just us getting so frustrated about the state of the environment and politics or something like that, that we find ourselves screaming as loudly as everybody else and not getting as far, and it feels like we're spinning wheels. But instead, we're really going still deeper into the leverage points of change that need to be part of the integration between our own messy and beautiful story with our collective messy and beautiful story as humans.
You've talked both East and West Coast, but Phil Riley here is doing it on the ground in the middle of Canada, and I think it's his turn.
Yeah, we had an interesting discussion about kids being outfitted, this is educationally outfitted, in order to be more self-sufficient. So we went back to the education system, and we were bemoaning the fact that secondary school education systems have basically abandoned teachings of trade skills, so that either, you know, being able to operate in a kitchen, a garage, or a farm field, we need to be able to get those skills back to a greater number of people, so that in these times when we have much more time available to spend, we have the ability to contribute some of those skills that are really shorthanded. And I'm thinking in terms of how many of the kids are really interested in doing landscaping or helping crop farm fields or things like that. And we have depended a lot on temporary immigrants to come in to do those sweat creating jobs. That's where we spent most of our time. And you know, just going back to one of the presentations that Julia made, she referenced that Windhorse Farms in Nova Scotia was one of the groups that she was looking at. I had the privilege of traveling with the Drescher family with Elizabeth May on the cross-country trip to protest the clear cutting of Clayoquot Sound. And what a beautiful family. And when we went to Nova Scotia, we went to visit Windhorse Farms, and I was blown away with how a family could initiate a local educational program on their farm, which started out featuring drawn horse powered forestry practices.
You know, it links back, Phil, to, I think, Ted, you raised the question, how do we share success stories? And
well,
as
I
I'm
always
listening
think
to this,
that we have to rely on all of you guys to provide the success stories, and then we got to try and figure out what they really mean. And once we even have a good list, how on earth are we going to get them to the people who need to see them? So, and that's a challenge for another day.
Absolutely. And I think certainly one for CACOR to consider taking on. So I'm aware that we're about 4 minutes from our conclusion time, and I'm seeing, you know, people are having to leave. We do have, you know, kind of to bring this full circle back to that place of grounding and connection with ourselves, a special treat, which Julia, I don't want to lose. But maybe before sharing that, some final reflections, Julia, from you on anything you'd like to leave the group with. And a thank you from me, and then I'll leave it to Ted or Art for closing comments from CACOR.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I want to say how much these presentations for me are always as much of a learning and a kind of waking up for myself around what's happening and what are the possibilities. And just to say that this feeling of uncertainty and of not being able to tie all the pieces together, although it's very uncomfortable for us as human beings, is part of the moving forward. And our capacity to not hold on to what's familiar just because it feels familiar is something that is a capacity for, I think, creating the future that we can almost feel. So I want to conclude, as Charles invited, with something that is a practice for myself in being aware of the present moment and of also embracing what's not known. And I trained as a classical violinist and gradually have moved more towards improvisation because it puts me on the stage in a way where I really don't know what's going to happen next. And where I have to step into it knowing that it will be exactly what it needs to be. So I'm going to be improvising some sound that I hope will maybe reflect some of the conversations we have. And the invitation is to allow it to also spark for you a feeling or a vision of what this future that we're creating together might feel like and might look like.
What a great way to end this session. It's got us all back almost relaxed again, Julia. That's not bad. We can unclench our fists from turning on the TV or anything like that.
Okay, yeah. We would like to wind this up and close out the recording as well. And Ted, could you thank our speakers?
That's exactly what I was about to do, Art. In fact, we can do it in stereo. Yes, it's been special again, Julia. I had the great fortune of hearing her do something not unlike this previously. And again, bringing so many things together, so many ideas together, so many people's approaches together in helping actually find, I guess, a better way. At least that's what we're all trying to do. I would particularly like to thank Julia and Charles for bringing together something that got almost everybody talking, almost everybody's ideas on the table, and also identified a lot of reasons for us to get together sometime in the future and do it again, trying to take it one notch further. So again, on behalf of CACOR and our members and all of the other guests that we've managed to attract, what a great day. And thank you all very much for coming. Thank you particularly to Julia and Charles, and we must do this again. Thank you.
Okay, and I'd just like to add that we would like to invite those guests who have joined in for this conversation, that we are on a weekly basis coming up with new material, and we would like to welcome you to subscribe to our YouTube channel when I do post this later today. I don't have all your email addresses, but you can get a hold of us at the URL on the page now, and we do ask that you consider joining us and becoming a member. with that, I would like to end our YouTube, and we'll see you all next week.